I'd like to welcome to your show and mine, Bobby Ramos' Bottom Line, the author of a fantastic book, Macho Time, The Meteoric Rise and Tragic Fall of Hector Macho Camacho, authored by my buddy, Mr. Christian Judah J. Christian, welcome back to the show.
Hey, it is absolute treat to be back here, Bobby. You got my name perfect, man. That was perfect.
Yeah, it's about time after the 20 times I've talked to you. Finally got it right. But folks, before we get started, don't forget to go to my website, Bobby Ramos' Bottom Line, to see my fantastic review about this great book. And check out, Showtime has streaming the Hector Camacho story. Fantastic look on Showtime. First of all, I gotta say, I've read a lot of books in my time, and your book has the most interesting and exciting covers, front, back, the liner that I've ever seen. We all know that Camacho loved his leopard print, and that's what's on the book. And it's just like amazing. Folks, when you open it up, you see the leopard print on the inside. It's such an eye grab, man. Whoever came up with that, man, great idea.
Bobby, it's a really interesting story. We had an original cover, and it didn't really highlight the flash and the charisma of Camacho. That's what defined him, and it just so we actually changed the cover, and the Hamilcar Publishing, who I worked with, they did such they wanted to make this a signature book. They wanted people to see just the flair and you love just the print, the macho in gold, and I remember just falling in love with it when I saw it, and it's unlike, as far as the style and the flair of it, it's unlike any of the other books.
Never seen anything like it. And for the folks, you got to remember the flair that Macho had. Bam. Okay. The boy could fight, but he had that flair. Now, I got to get into, for the record, for those of you who may not remember or didn't know how great Hector Macho Camacho was as a fighter, his ring record was 79, 6-3. That means 79 wins, 6 losses, and three draws. As an amateur, he was 96-4. 96-4 as an amateur. And you see all these fighters now, and they're champions with 30 and 25 fights under their belt. It's just ridiculous. And for you kids out there who don't know him, look him up, check him out on YouTube. But he beat some of the biggest names in boxing. Edwin Rosario, Olympic champion, Howard Davis Jr., Boom Boom Mancini, Vinny Pazienza. A technical knockout over my boy, the great Sugar Ray Leonard. And folks, I want you to hear me loud and clear on this. I got to readjust, Christian. He beat Duran. He beat Roberto Duran twice. He beat Roberto Duran twice. I mean, that's the kind of fighter that he was. Talk about him as a fighter.
Yeah, I think what you really touch upon, and what everybody, when you ask someone to look back at Hector Camacho, the fights you named are the ones that people were certainly drawn to. I think if you looked at the early fights early on in his career, you saw a guy who had so many tools in his bag that you just couldn't. There's nothing that you could do to really disrupt what he was doing in the ring. He had movement. He had power. His power was generated off his speed. He threw in combinations that you couldn't even imagine. His movement was spectacular. I wrote a book on Wilfredo Gomez, and I remember watching Wilfredo Gomez. But the way Camacho moved around the ring, the way that he put himself in a position to punch, the way that his defense. I mean, some people think against some fighters, yeah, he did get hit. But I mean, he was a spectacular defensive fighter. I mean, he had everything that you wanted in a fighter, a young fighter coming up out of the amateurs. And when he started in 1980, from 1980 to 1985, he was just a brilliant boxer, fun to watch, aggressive, took the initiative, could lead, could counter, and all these things. And then you add the component of being an entertaining guy. I mean, it was just a tantalizing mix to watch him at this stage in his career. So I think the early version of Hector Camacho was nearly unbeatable. And I don't say that about many fighters, but you know, the one thing that I didn't even mention is he brought that edge from Spanish Harlem, and you know, and he incorporated that into his repertoire, Bobby. I mean, you know, a lot of tough guys, you know, they fight in, you know, when they fight in the ring, they don't necessarily adopt a lot of the, you know, the things that they did outside the ring or in street fighting. But actually, you know, when you think of a stylist like Camacho, you don't necessarily think about a guy who is just so tough that when you're not looking, he's going to pull your head down and give you an uppercut, you know, when you're not looking, and knock you out. I mean, so even if you wanted to get physical with him, you couldn't.
Right. Yeah. He just had everything going for him. And I wanted to get into this. This is your fourth great book about a Latino champion. And we showed the Gomez book that you had just talked about, but also you wrote about the Hands of Stone, Roberto Duran, and folks, everybody knew about Roberto Duran. Mm-hmm. They knew what a beast he was, and it's a fantastic book in its own right, done by Christian right there. So you're talking about Gomez, you're talking about Duran. You also did a fantastic book about my boy Alexis Arguello, beloved warrior. Fantastic book, fantastic fighter, and Warrior fit him 100%. 100% Warrior just fit Arguello. I have a couple of questions on these four guys that you did the books on. Which of the four stories in your books touched you the most?
Touched me the most. It had to. I think Alexis was, when you talk about Alexis was just different. The storyline was so much different than the other fighters. I mean, I think you know, writing about Camacho and seeing it through the eyes of his son and family members was heartbreaking at times. Especially the way that he died. But when I think about Alexis Arguello, I think about a guy who, you know, his story. There were so many different angles, so many different parts to his storyline that it was hard not to be touched by what happened to him. It was so sad. I mean, the Sandinistas took his, you know, expropriated his property. When he was fighting, he couldn't go. He could no longer go home, and you know, just to. I mean, that's where it started. That's where the storyline started. As soon as he became a champion, he could no longer go back to Nicaragua, and then it moved from there. And you know, after and I think watching Alexis and the deterioration of his, maybe deterioration isn't fair. I mean, his downfall. And the political element of it, and the mystery behind it, I think it was more. There was a shock value, but also this level of sorrow. Because if you looked at the four, I think they all meant so much to so Duran to Panama. When you look at Wilfredo Gomez to Puerto Rico, when you look at Camacho to Spanish Harlem, and you look at but with Alexis Arguello, he was Nicaragua. And to see that his people, you know, this political element turned on him like it did, it was just sad. And I think it transcended boxing so much that I think it was hard to grasp. And I think really, so Bobby, it was really hard to write as well, because you know, I had to go beyond the boxing scope and try to figure out how can I do Alexis justice and tell his story, but also get it right. And I didn't have that element with Camacho. I mean, Camacho, you know, it was sad and tragic that how the end of his life. especially when you look at how vibrant and how energized and how loving and passionate he could be when he was in his prime, and he was this fashion icon, but as well as this boxer. So I think it was a little bit different. The stories were a little bit different. And
that's leading to my next question. Which do you think was the most tragic of the stories?
I think the most tragic, Camacho. It's just,
Right.
and I might be saying that, Bobby, because it's so fresh. But the he had, and this goes for, I mean, it's a hard question, because I think you could probably go either way. But when you look at Hector Camacho and you listen to people talk about him, he had so much life. He had so much more to give, and I think our Alexis did too. Don't get me wrong, right. But I think with Camacho, one of the things, and one of the family members mentioned this later on in the book, and they said, you know what, I was waiting for Hector, or Mach, they would say, to be the guy that I thought he would be later on in his life, to kind of grow into that guy that I wanted him to be, and I believed he could be. And so when I talk about the tragedy, I mean, he was coming back. He's kind of recovering. He was reinvigorated a little bit. Had some TV shows going for him, but he couldn't get away from his vices and the drugs. That was his downfall. And I think when you see a guy who just is defined by the life that the life and the vibrancy, and then to see the way he died, that was too tragic. I couldn't. It's hard to compare any story to that one.
And what's interesting, it's sad, but out of Sugar Ray Leonard had a cocaine problem. Camacho did. Arguello did.
Right.
And there's a lot of, not just entertainers, but a lot of athletes, period, especially from that era, suffered with that beast on their back. For the folks who don't know, Arguello, as great as a champion as he was, and such a regal kind of guy, he had some demons, and he ended up committing suicide. Camacho was murdered. If you could question either one of them prior to, what would your one most pressing question be to each of them?
Well, the first thing with Arguello, I think we'd have to, to be honest, I think in the book I present it, I try to, I don't know if he committed suicide, and I know that we'll one day we'll figure out what the real truth behind that particular story is. I don't think that story has been unraveled completely.
Right.
But if I asked Alexis Arguello, one of the things that I think I would just want to know, at a period in his life when he couldn't go home, I'd want him, because I don't think he ever talked about it. I want to talk about, the thing, I'd ask him what he missed most, and how emotionally did he cope with that? Because he never talked. He was very, like you said, regal. He was a gentleman of the ring.
Right.
People loved him, right? Because of the way that he treated others with such respect, and he gained that respect. The media loved him because he was this gentleman of the ring. But I want to know, what was it like? How did you manage being, forced out of your homeland and thinking that you would never return again? And so I want him to just talk about that. And also I'd ask him, because, I got to speak with him and interview him a little bit for the book, but I want to know, as far as, the knockout style. I always thought that he timed it perfectly in a fight about when he wanted to take an opponent out. And I'd ask him that. I'd say, Alexis, it seemed like you turned it on when you wanted to. Was that something natural, or was that something that it just happened? Or did you calculate it? Because I feel like in each of those fights, late in a lot of those fights, he moved methodically, and then he sped up. So I'd want to know about his style. So I'd have a stylistic question, but I also want to know more of the emotional question. And with Camacho, I want to know about what it feels like to be a hero of Spanish Harlem, and because I think there's twofold question with this, because he was truly a hero to a lot of those young kids. A lot of the people I interviewed said, people don't really understand. But when I was growing up, I looked at Hector Camacho. I wasn't a boxer, but I knew that I felt like if he could do something like that, I could do something. It didn't have to be boxing, but it was just a motivation to see him running through the streets of Spanish Harlem. And I'd want to know what it felt like to be a hero of Spanish Harlem and the pressures that he felt coming out and being a professional fighter, because a lot of those guys in that neighborhood didn't think he'd ever get beyond get beyond the amateurs because of all the trouble that he was getting into. So I want to know, what was it like being a hero of Spanish Harlem? And the second thing is that I really want to know is, why didn't you ever did you ever talk to someone? Did you ever seek help? Because it doesn't seem like toward the end of his life, it seemed like, and from all interviews that I did for the book, that he never sought help for all the problems that he was facing, and it just started to pile up as his career went on.
Kristen, you mentioned that you're not sure that Arguello committed suicide. What do you think probably happened there?
No, I think the Sandinistas pressured him into. I think they put him into a corner. Like they pressured him physically and mentally one night, and that his last night of his life. I don't know. It's hard for me to say. I don't know if he committed suicide, but I just don't. But I also I don't put anything past the Sandinistas as to what they're capable of, if that makes any sense. So I don't know the answer to that question. I do think we will know one day what the answer to that question is, but probably not for a long time.
Long time. Your Duran book, that was turned into a major movie starring Robert De Niro. Camacho was such a lightning rod. I know you would like it to happen, but could you see that being turned into a movie? His story?
Oh, even more so. I mean, it's just with Camacho. I think Duran. I mean, let's talk about Duran coming up in Panama and just so many areas to focus on with Duran. I mean, just a beloved fighter. But I think Camacho, his story, coming out of Spanish Harlem, fleeing Puerto Rico at age 4 because of an abusive father, fleeing Puerto Rico with his mother at age 4, then growing up on his own, pretty much on his own in Spanish Harlem, becoming a hero, breaking out of Spanish Harlem, winning 3 titles. Then you have the unfortunate storyline of the drug issue. But I think his story makes such a compelling movie, and I think about it every day, because there are so many young actors who I could just envision as a young Hector Camacho. So I just have to say, I mean, it's a story that's got to be made as a movie. I mean, it's and I think now, especially with with boxing movies, I don't think it has to be a boxing movie, but I think the movie has to humanize Hector rather than just make it a straight boxing movie.
I wanted to bring this up. In your book, the first paragraph of the foreword, written by Carlos Acevedo, he stated that Camacho, and I quote, was garish, crude, outlandish, rude, reckless, and loud. And everyone paid attention to him, and he made sure of that, close quote. My question for that is, and he also said that he was the first fighter since Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali in the 60s to master the art of negative appeal. I would agree with that. I think that Sonny Liston had a negative image, and George Foreman, people forget in his early days, but they were known as just bad guys and monsters. Ali and Camacho came from a whole different vein. Based on that, do you think with social media being the way it is today, how do you think that would have worked with Camacho? I mean, because everything you do, everything you say is boom, 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 out there, out there, out there. And he loved the attention. He loved the attention. I could see where he would have loved it, my opinion, but I can see where it would have ate him up.
I was just gonna say, you literally stole the words, Bobby, right out of my mouth. I think it would have. No, you took it. I was just about to say it would have engulfed him. I mean, it would have been overwhelming. I don't think there were too many things happening with Camacho. I mean, I think with social media, if you take certain risks, calculated risk, and you have a strategy on you know, and on how to use social media as a tool, and someone was leading that with Hector, I think maybe it would have been successful. But there are too many different you know, how do I say it? Too many different platforms for him. I think it would have, you know, like when you said ate him up, I mean, he was so off the cuff that it just wouldn't have been received in the same way. And I think that he came along just at the right time in his career. The boxing world needed Hector Camacho. Sugar Ray Leonard was toward the end of his career, and Sugar Ray endorsed Camacho and said, "Hey, this guy can do it. This guy can be the next Sugar Ray. He just needs to." You know, he needs to be settled down, and he can't continue to live the life that he's living. But you make up you bring a great point up when you say it would have eaten him up, because I just think, especially with a lot of these athletes, that, you know, first of all, they allow social media to become too big of an influence in their life, and I think he might have been. You know, he might have that might have been a major issue with Camacho. But you know, when he was coming up, you know, he was the original. You know, Mayweather came on later on. You know, Jorge Paez was a guy who was also flashy, and
yeah, he was out there too.
Yeah. But none of them were like Camacho. Camacho was willing to move. You know, he might have been brash and crude at times and arrogant, but there was always a method to his madness. It wasn't just like, I'm going to be like that to raise the ire of my opponent. It was like, I'm going to be like that, but at the same time, I'm going to dance to the ring and have fun, okay, at your expense, even if it's going to get you upset. Like, so I understand that part. The costumes, it all worked together, and I think too many of the boxers who tried to follow his lead were one-dimensional, in the sense that they could be the heel and sell tickets that way. Camacho was fun. I mean, he was spectacular in that ring. He would dance for a half hour before he even got out there.
Right.
And even when he was on the backside of his career, you went to see him, even if you didn't like him. I remember against Ray Mancini, I wasn't a huge fan of Camacho, and I remember watching that fight, and I was thinking, you know, I loved Camacho when he was, 20, 21 years old. I was like just mesmerized by that guy. But when he fought Mancini, I did not like him. So he was doing something right.
Yeah, I was always a big fan of his. What he had going also for him, first of all, as far as men, yeah, he was cocky, talked a lot of crap and all of that. But he also had this likable, lovable quality, like he was your little brother. You just wanted to give him a noogie in the head and kick him in the ass, tell him shut up and then go on about his business. That's just he just had that about himself. And also, as far as the ladies, I mean, he was a sharp-looking guy, and the ladies loved him. He just had a lot going for him. He just had a lot going for him. And for the younger fans who don't know or people forgot, like I said, he won 3 separate championships in 3 different weight classes. He's in the Hall of Fame, and he was just that unique of a fighter. Talk about how he was pegged for stardom very early in his career, And, 8, 10 fights, he was pegged as a superstar. And already CBS Channel 2 was already broadcasting his fights. Do you think that helped him or hurt him?
No, that was what made him. I mean, I think so. Having that type of success and that type of exposure early on was really what made Hector Camacho. I mean, he had all the skills, but I think seeing him come up on CBS. I mean, there was just something special about him. I mean, old time fighters were saying he's doing things that are you wouldn't ever imagine a young fighter at this age to do. And I think when you have guys like Gil Clancy, who was just a master, a reader of great boxers, and he was in love with Hector Camacho, and so I think having that exposure
Clancy was kind of a tough guy too.
Yeah,
he was
talking about Clancy.
Guy.
Yeah. He was. I mean, he wasn't. And Hector was drawn. Drawn to trainers and mentors who were straightforward, who were tough, but also had an affectionate side to him and to them. And I think coming up on CBS I really think it was the best thing that ever happened to him, because I think it gave him more focus to say, okay, I'm the star now, rather than fighting 30 fights, against, not mediocre competition. I think it forced him to fight good fighters and make good matchups early on, rather than going through 35, patsies and having to kind of build his resume that way. So his 15th fight, he was fighting an undefeated fighter and Louis Lloyd. And then he was fighting guys like Johnny Sato. So I think that forced him not only to focus, but also to test himself against good fighters. I mean, these are pretty good fighters to fight at that stage in his career. So, I would have rather him. I think that was the right way to bring Hector up. I don't think you had any other choice, because there was always that concern. There was always that fear that he was going to unravel, that he was going to fall back on some of the, some of the things that he was doing.
So they wanted to get him when times were good also, just from the selfish side of it. CBS, they knew that there were some issues with him. And I think that they wanted to hitch to his wagon because he may flame out for whatever reason. He didn't, but they knew it was very possible.
Yeah, I mean, and that was, you couldn't find a fighter, who had those attributes, and at the same time, was as entertaining at that stage. He just had those qualities, and you're right. I mean, I think hitching it to the Camacho wagon, was vital. I mean, for both CBS and Camacho at that time. That what they didn't take into account, or what they couldn't foresee, was the managerial problems and the inactivity that plagued him later on.
Right. One of the things that, there was a couple of things that I really loved about him. He was tough as hell, and that was something he didn't get credit for. But he had everybody knew he had incredible hand and foot speed. But he reminded me of the recent, as you said, Floyd Mayweather. Quick hands, quick feet, and a great defensive fighter. He had a lot of similarities with Floyd Mayweather, except for one thing. He had a better punch than Mayweather. Camacho, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, he had more power than a lot of people realize. Freddie Roach, everybody knows him as the great trainer today, but he was also a pretty good fighter in his day. And he fought and lost to Camacho. And what he said was, his hand speed was something that was at another level, that he wasn't prepared for that. And he ended up biting. Camacho. So I just want the young fans to know, Tyson wasn't the only fighter to bite somebody in the ring. Okay. Freddie Roach, Mr. Grandfatherly, great trainer, bit Camacho in the ring because he couldn't deal with him. So I just wanted to put that out there so people know that. Also, Christian, I think it's great that you focused just about all of your book on Camacho's life and where he came from, and not just his death. Like all the other Latino fighters and most fighters, period, these cats came from poverty. Talk a little bit more about just what it was like for Camacho being raised in Spanish Harlem in New York to rise and be a 3 different weight champion.
Yeah, I mean, at the time when they came, like I said, at age 4, he came back to Spanish Harlem from Puerto Rico, and they were fleeing an abusive father, and the problem is that his mother Maria couldn't find work at the time, and she was all so they were moving all over Spanish Harlem and trying to find a place to live, but at the same time that a lot of the places didn't have heat. I mean, just certain places they wanted to find and settle into a place that gave them a sense of permanency. But his father followed the family and eventually came back and to live with them. And so it wasn't only the poverty, but also the fear that he had to protect his mother at a young age. So I think those things combined, and then realizing that he had Maria Camacho was excellent mother in the sense that they always, even in the most difficult times, they always had food on the table, and that was something that his sisters mentioned. And I think that not only the poverty, but
he loved his mother's oatmeal.
Yeah,
loved his mother's oatmeal.
Well, the relationship with Hector and his mother was something that you didn't go near. It was untouchable. I mean, he loved her dearly. But when you talk about the things that he was doing, the issue is, and I think and I mentioned this in the book, is that he may have grown up in poverty, but he never felt as if he was poor. And I think I wanted to make that distinction in the book itself, because that family was always around. There was always a sense of community in Spanish Harlem. And I think that and this was from quotes that I was able to piece together, that it didn't feel like they were subjected to that level of poverty at the time. And when you look back at some of these other fighters that I wrote about, I think that that having that strong family backbone was able to a lot of times just I don't want to say reduce that feeling of what what time is. It's macho time.
Macho time.
It's macho time.
There you go.
But he had a difficult childhood. Just also transition to living in New York, but he was tough. I mean, and moving from karate to boxing, and kind of honing his skills.
Loved him some Bruce Lee.
Yeah,
his guy was Bruce Lee, which is tragic in itself, with both of them being shot to death. One by accident, one not. But he loved Bruce Lee.
Yeah, and they were at the movie theater. One of his old friends told me this story about it. They were at a movie theater,
okay,
and Hector showed up in the Bruce Lee outfit, and they were on a double date. Really? He showed up in the black and yellow Bruce Lee outfit, and these guys behind them started mocking him, right. And Hector just stayed cool, didn't say a thing.
Right.
And then they didn't say anything else. And then later on, as the movie continued, they started mocking him again. And his friend explained it as Hector just turned around and gave them a look. And that was the look, like I know you're there, and
you don't want none of this. You don't want
you don't want
this. Right.
In other words, it's macho time. So at the end of the movie, they were all leaving, and they're outside the theater, and Hector says, "Hey, buddy, hold on for a sec." And he goes over these guys, and I guess the girls looked at his friend and said, "Are you going to do anything? Are you going to do something about this? Are you going to help him?" And by the time he turned around, Hector knocked out both of the two of the guys, and the last one was running away. So it was. I
macho
think
time.
If you just looked at him, and his size, you would never guess that he was just one of the toughest guys on the street. I
No,
mean,
I stood next to him at a fight in New York, and we were just going back and forth, just talking and stuff. And I was shocked at how small he was to me. I mean, he wasn't he just because of TV and us watching, and we see guys destroy guys, they seem bigger than some of them actually are. And he seemed like just a regular brother off the streets. But knowing him, I knew you didn't want to get on his other side because I knew what he could do. But he physically wasn't an imposing guy. It's just he beat your ass in a minute. And he didn't really need too many excuses to do it. That being said,
I want to add one thing, Bobby. Let me add one thing, and just and I apologize for cutting you off there, but the interesting thing about, with all of these fighters, they were all good street fighters.
Right.
But Hector, I just found it really interesting that he was a guy who, even if you were his best friend, it didn't matter. Like you had, if he was upset, he would beat you up and then he'd come over your house the next day. And he was just that type of guy. And so, you have a lot of, but at the same time, a lot of those guys he grew up with, they just loved him dearly. And that was just, that was also part of Spanish Harlem. Like you fought, you got up, you shook hands, and you moved on.
It was over. It was over. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to talk about. You talked about he had an issue, and you were talking to folks. You need to get this book. All of the stuff we're talking about, and so much more, is in this great book that we're talking about today. He wanted to be accepted by native-born Puerto Ricans as one of their own, and he felt that they classified him as an outsider. In '83, when he fought Salas, Rafael Solis, he got booed and heckled, and you wrote in the book where he said he felt like he was an inferior Puerto Rican, and he said that I'm a Puerto Rican, but if you don't want me, I'm macho. Forget it. Close quote. He was a deeply sensitive guy, and that's the other side of him, because everybody knew the flamboyant and the mouthy and the talk all kinds of trash, but he had a real sensitive side to him.
Yeah, I wanted to bring from the beginning. I wanted to bring that out in him. I wanted people to understand that this is the same guy after a fight with Tim Ryan during an interview broke down and said, "I need friends." I mean, it was just he was a different type of guy. Like you said, he felt there was a sense of he wanted to be accepted, and he didn't understand it. Like he didn't understand that. They had, even when he was fighting another Puerto Rican fighter, whether it was Rosario or Solis, there were those Puerto Ricans who just did not accept him. And he had felt like he'd done everything to gain their acceptance. Like, what haven't I done? What more do I need to do to prove to you that I'm a true Puerto Rican? And although some people downplayed that and didn't feel like it was a big issue, I felt like through a lot of the interviews and a lot of the research that I did, that this was a very sensitive topic with him. And like you said with that quote, he even came out and a lot of the things that Hector Camacho said, there are some things that he had to take with a grain of salt. But I truly believe that he meant when he said, you know what? If you don't want me, forget you. I mean, this is me. I've done enough to deserve your respect. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, but sensitive didn't just end there, Bobby. I think it went to every aspect of his life. When you talk about overly sensitive, I think a lot of it stemmed from the problems he was having outside the ring and the fact that they had just built up over time. But and I also think that he felt that having gone to being looked at even from a young age as that kid from Rikers, having done time, you know, and he didn't
Stealing
feel,
the car.
yeah, and he just felt like I've been trying to break away from that ever since, and so he'd be upset about that. He's like, I'm not that kid anymore. You know, I've done enough. You know, here I am. I'm winning my second title, my third title. All right, I don't want to be known forever as this, you know, troubled kid coming out of Spanish Harlem. But the problem is that even after he said that, he'd do something to kind of reinforce that particular label, which was sad in itself.
You know, I tell you what I liken him to, and I never really thought about it until listening to you talk. Another supremely talented champion went through the same thing, and that was Oscar De La Hoya. He went through the same thing. Remember, he felt he wasn't, because he wasn't, the Mexicans loved tough fighters, and he was a good-looking guy that all the ladies loved, and he felt he wasn't accepted by a lot of the men in Mexico because he wasn't flamboyant, but he was just a different style fighter. They wanted you to go out on your shield, and De La Hoya would, but he was just so supremely talented, and yeah, he had some ballerina in him. And I'm not just trying to be funny. He could have been another Sugar Ray. He just had that style that a lot of Mexican men did not like. And I think Camacho dealt with some of that as far as his own Puerto Rican community.
I wonder if that's it. You know, I didn't touch upon that in the book because I think, you know, with Solis, so when you matched Hector, first of all, when he fought Bazooka Limon and won the first title in 1983, he was.
What's the big deal? When you beat a man named Bazooka, you ain't no joke. Go ahead. I'm sorry, man.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, he beat a real tough guy in Bazooka Limon, and a great, you know, a really good Mexican fighter who was on the back end of his career. But I mean, you know, the Puerto Rican fans, I mean, he did it in front of all of Puerto Rico. So he'd won them over at that point. Right. So I don't think there was concern there. He said, you know, I just won a title. It's almost like I just won a title for you. And then he came back to defend it. And I think that's where the shock value came in. Wait, you know, almost like, wait a second. I was just here and I just, you know, destroyed a Mexican fighter. We have this huge rivalry. What are we talking about here? This is a little bit unjustified. So I think that De La Hoya's was more about the style.
Yeah.
But yeah. I don't think that was as much as, I don't think that played into the argument where Puerto Ricans didn't love or didn't respect Hector. I feel like it was maybe something else, because when he beat Solis, I mean, he knocked him out. I mean, he just, you know, he knocked him out with a brutal knockout punch. And then he stood up to Edwin Rosario, even though, you know, he got hit a couple times. I mean, he showed his toughness. So I think it's probably something else, jealousy. I don't know what it was at the time. But
you know, he showed his toughness also September '92 when he fought Julio Cesar Chavez, who was 81-0 at the time. He lost, he got beat, but he showed how tough he was. I mean, he got it handed to him that night. He didn't quit. He didn't do no mas. He took it. And I think that some people gained even though he lost, gained a different kind of respect for him, because he showed that he was a tough son of a bitch, even though he lost.
Yeah, and that's the irony of his career, right? I mean, he had to take a beating in order to gain respect, and which was at that stage, because that fight was supposed to be made, you know, many years earlier. And can you imagine that fight in 1985? That would have been spectacular. After he beat Jose Luis Ramirez, and he fights Chavez. I mean, what a fight that would have been, because Hector would have been in shape. He was fast. He could move. All the things that that, you know, Chavez didn't like. And then, you know, it didn't happen until much later. At that point, you know, and it's such a strange thing to think about. But I mean, you watch that fight and you think that Chavez was, you know, the young up and coming fighter who was just rolling through guys, which he was at the time, but he wasn't a young up and coming. You know, they're the same age. And you wouldn't have known that, by the way, by the way that the fight was, the promotion was handled. Because Hector, for the first time in his life, did not want to incite Chavez. He did not want to do it because he knew the repercussions. You get this guy mad, and you pay the price. There's a real harsh price you pay with Chavez, because he's not going to knock you out. But you're gonna
punish him.
Yeah, he's going to punish you.
He's going to do what Ali did to Floyd Patterson.
Right.
He's going to punish you. He ain't going to knock you out. He could have, and the press killed Clay then, but they killed him for that because they said he was so mean-spirited that he could have knocked him out, but he wanted to punish him, and for calling him Clay. And yeah, here's another thing. Sugar Ray Leonard, who, as I said earlier, lost to Macho. And he had said in your book, he said that he found, and they liked each other a lot. He said, Sugar Ray said, and I quote, "I thought I was cocky. Camacho surpasses me by 3 or 4 levels." Close quote. That being said, do you think, as much as you've seen the other side of Camacho, do you think that cockiness was 100% raw cockiness and real? Or do you think, I think it was hiding some of his insecurities?
Well,
he wanted to be liked, he wanted to be loved. And most guys who were that cocky may not always feel that way. I kind of think he was a two-sided monster.
Right. No, I think
within himself, not towards people, within himself.
Yeah, I mean, you said it hides insecurities. I mean, there's no doubt that he was using that brash, almost that really arrogant, boisterous style to hide a lot of the insecurities that he was feeling as he, especially as as an older fighter. He realized that he needed to, change his identity. In his mind, he needed to change his identity. But along with that meant changing his style, and which may have lengthened his career, but at the same time, it hurt his legacy. Because and I think it all goes back to the idea that he's becoming this. He's becoming this particular. I don't want to say a caricature almost, but he's coming into this character who is, now I'm the macho man, and I'm going to use these costumes, and it felt like a lot of times it felt genuine, but like you said, it hit all the things that he was going through, and he was an emotionally troubled guy who, at the time, even when people wanted to approach him and say, hey, you got to slow down the way you're living, he would brush it off. You just couldn't talk to him. So I think there's that insecurity level that he was trying to get, like this facade he was creating, not only to sell tickets, but also to kind of, blind people to who he really was. And I think, Bobby, that character came out, the real Hector came out sometimes. I think it emerged at times, but he quickly put it away. I mean, you rarely saw it for lengthy periods of times. It would emerge, like I said, with the Tim Ryan interview. I mean, that was shocking to see him crying on national TV. But then it was macho time the next morning, right? I mean, it wasn't something that he dwelled on. So I think you hit it right on the spot when you said that he was hiding his own insecurities.
And here he is, crying on Tim Ryan right there. Another fighter who was masking the same kind of insecurities was his buddy Mike Tyson. Tyson has said he's a real sensitive guy, for the nastiest guy on the planet. People didn't imagine he was home feeding pigeons and all that. He was just a super sensitive guy who would cry at the drop of a hat. Okay, so some of these guys, they have to put up that facade because of what their business is, and they have to handle their business. But there is another side to him. There's a guy on page 97 in his fantastic book Macho Time. I forgot his first name, but his last name was Maida, Maida, and he said that Hector, he was a lifelong friend. He said Hector liked to be by himself. This shocked me. He said he liked to be by himself, and he never trusted friends. That he was always more to himself. That's who he was. He was more of a loner. Close quote. That shocked me.
Yeah, no one would have guessed that. I mean, that shocked me when I remember that interview and thinking, but the fact is that and that Maeda that's the mother of Hector Jr.
Okay.
And so she when she first came out and said that, she wasn't the first one to say that. Like, another one of his acquaintances in Spanish Harlem would say, he was a guy who liked the attention. When he was around, he wanted to be the center of the attention, but he probably felt more comfortable by himself, or just kind of in his own thoughts. And I think that's I don't want to say it's shocking, but I think if someone who didn't know Hector and only knew him as the Macho Man, you would never, you couldn't even imagine that Hector Camacho was a guy who wanted to be on his own. I mean, just because everybody gravitates toward him, even when he's not really, he would take risks and do anything, to get people's attention. And a lot of times, these risks were, had consequences that made people around him feel terrible. It really hurt people around him. And sometimes he didn't see that. But it just shows you how many different facets to his personality that he had.
And for the folks who don't know or don't remember, Christians talked twice about crying in the ring to the CBS announcer Tim Ryan, who likes him a lot. That was right on television, and when you watch it, it was so sad. He had just won a fight, and he says to Tim Ryan, "Will you be my friend? I need friends." And he put his head on his chest and just started crying. And Tim Ryan says, we have a young man here who just won a fight, and he's full of emotions, and he was trying to cover up for him, and he just wasn't this bragging all the time, tough guy who was talking shit all the time. He just wasn't that. Let me ask you this. Camacho's drug problems are well documented. When do you think they started, and why?
Well, I think they started when he was, probably in his teens, in Spanish Harlem. I mean, I think probably, it was, and I think so he and I know that for a fact, because in one of his interviews he admits to it. If in Spanish Harlem, everybody smokes. When they became intense, or they intensified, I think it's probably as he got closer through his amateurs and then leading into his professional, he probably was able to pull away from them as he prepared for each fight. So I think they started at a very young age, because as he said, it was just, everyone in Spanish Harlem, this was the norm. So I don't think he, an outside observer may look at it and say, it ruined his career. But he probably doesn't look at it like, he wouldn't look at it like that. He would just, it was a part of the culture that he grew up in.
Right.
What's fascinating about Camacho is that he was able to somehow remain an elite fighter and still and still not, not remove that element of, the drug element out of his life. I mean, it stayed with him throughout, according, to the research that I did. He never truly stopped, but it never, permeated his career to the point where, he had to stop. And usually when you see these sad stories, it's because drugs take over your life, and you can't manage them anymore. And then, obviously, you stop boxing. But Hector was able to balance both those worlds, and that's something that I do not have an answer for. I have no idea how he was able to be able to take drugs and still, for as long as he did, remain one of the top fighters in the sport. So, because I remember Sugar. For me, it depends on how you look at his career. I mean, I don't think he was, after 1985, I don't think he was, he reached that elite status again. And so, some people don't accept that. Some people think he was still an elite fighter later on, but I have a tendency to believe that his prime was 1980 through 85.
Right. The other thing about him, he didn't have a lot of formal education, but he was a really smart guy. He was a very intelligent guy. He just didn't have the formal education. And Sugar Ray Leonard, once again, who really enjoyed him, said that as a fighter, and Sugar Ray had everything. He said that Macho had the whole package. That when he was at his best, he was perfect. And that's from Sugar Ray Leonard. That's a big deal. That for him to say that about somebody, just carried a lot of weight with me. I don't know. I don't know if Macho was a dream deferred. It's kind of hard to say that when somebody was a 3-time champion, 3 different divisions, but it was obvious later in life, the drugs took over, and the whole thing with the cops and hiding the cocaine in the jail and all that stuff. The drugs had really taken over him. And that's why I loved one of your earlier questions when you said you would have asked him, did he ever seek any kind of help? Folks, you're listening to Your Show and Mine, Bobby Ramos Bottom Line, here with Christian Juje. I think I got it right that time.
You got it right.
Author of the fantastic book, Macho Time, The Meteoric Rise and the Tragic Fall of Hector Macho Camacho. Page 84. Explain this to me, because I never found out why. He visited the White House and President Ronald Reagan. How was that hooked up, and why?
Well, at the time, and so, the reason as to why he was chosen, I didn't get into that, because I talked to his trainer at that time, who was Ismail Leandri, and he just didn't have. I didn't get an answer about why he was. I mean, he was. Oh, well, actually, I do know the reason why he was there is because Ronald Reagan absolutely loved him as a fighter. So I guess that would be the, okay. I was thinking of more of I think that's the main thing, is that Reagan called for him because he called him an artist in the ring. And that was huge. I mean, seeing that picture of Hector Camacho in the White House is mind-boggling.
From Spanish Harlem in the streets to the White House with the most staunch and Republican of Republicans, Ronald Reagan, on top of it.
Yeah, and it just goes to show you the different avenues, the different worlds that Hector. I mean, Hector is pretty comfortable in a lot of different social settings. And sometimes maybe that's not true in all the social settings, but I think his style. I mean, just looking at him and looking at that, whether he had the tail in the back, the leather jacket, the half shirt, the curl in the front, the spit curl. I mean. Yeah. There was, when you talk, he said, I'm the kid of the 80s. I mean, he was. I mean, he was. I mean, when you look at all the things that he was able to kind of reflect in his style, in the way he boxed, in the way that that he entertained. I mean, Hagler, Leonard, Duran, Holmes, Spinks. They were all great fighters of the 80s.
Right.
I don't think any of them was able to put together that full package. I mean, we talk about pure boxers. I don't think Camacho didn't do didn't do throughout his career what those guys did. It'd be hard to compare them. But when you talk about what he was able to put together in the full package, as far as promotions and flair and charisma and speed. I mean, it's hard to. You couldn't make it up. You couldn't reinvent a guy like Hector Camacho.
And you had a fantastic, a glorious line on page 126 when you were talking about three of the fighters that you wrote about. And I quote, you said, Alexis Arguello had respect, Roberto Duran had cachet, Hector Camacho had presence.
Yeah.
Hey, man, I would have gave you a gold star that day. The gold would have matched on the book. But yeah, that was a great line, man. That was just a great line. My next
Bobby, you know what? And just I've gotten it's just I've gotten lucky. If I would have guessed that I would be able to write about those four guys. I mean, I'm being honest. I don't think that there was a second out of writing those books that I felt like it was work. And just because a lot of those stories just write themselves. I mean, they were just fabulous subjects, beloved. And I was just lucky to get a chance to write about them.
All right. Let me ask you this. Of the four great Latino champions that you've written books about, Roberto Duran, Wilfredo Gomez, Alexis Arguello, and Camacho, who do you think was the greatest fighter of the four and why? Oh, you on the spot now, bro. Let me give you a close-up. You on the spot.
Well, I can't. It would go Duran, Arguello, Gomez, and Camacho. I mean, Duran. He just accomplished too much for. I mean, when he beat Leonard in 1980. I mean, he had already accomplished more than most fighters did in their entire careers at that point. And the best 135 pounder ever. I mean, it's just longevity, the number of titles, the resurgence coming back against Davey Moore. I have to put him above Arguello, and I think probably most boxing analysts would probably say the same thing. It's just sad that when you look at Arguello, he had to he had to fight Aaron Pryor to.
I was going to bring that up. That was his beast. Everybody has somebody who has their number, and the Hawk. Yeah. He those were two brutal fights, man. I mean, both guys laid it out there.
Yeah, but I mean, that's how he came into the public conscience is through Aaron Pryor, and and it's just the reality of that. I mean, he deserved a lot better than certainly those were super fights, but the way that Pryor handled him in those two fights, it's just hard to say that that what he did as a fighter, as great as he was, I would just have trouble putting him above Roberto Duran. But then again, I'd have trouble putting anybody above Roberto Duran, except maybe a handful of fighters. So,
2011, Camacho goes back to Puerto Rico, and he was shot in I believe it was February. And they think it was a drug deal going bad. Well, matter of fact, it was November 20th of 2012 when this incident happened in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, and he was in the car with this guy with a bad reputation, Adrian Moreno, and from all reports, it was supposedly a drug deal gone bad, and Moreno was shot 3 times, died. Macho was shot in the face, and the bullet traveled and lodging in his shoulder and tearing up his arteries. And I believe he died like 3 or 4 days later at 50 years old. And to him, I just hope that he's in peace, because when I look at that, you just don't expect a guy at that age who had that much going for him that would end that way, even though he was a street guy. It seems to me that the street life is what brought him down. I understand the drug problem, but I think the street life, I think he was like I think his sister said that he was never able to beat the street life. Would you agree with that?
I think to an extent, I think you're absolutely right. Is that he was never able to kind of break free from that. It's hard, because I think when I was writing the book with Hector Jr., I was I didn't want to get into discussions with him that he wasn't ready to have at that point about his father.
Of course, right.
But one of the things he said, I worried every phone call that I got at that point in his life would be a call saying, something terrible has happened to your father, whether he's got shot, whatever it was. So they knew kind of, he had a good idea of where he was and the things that he was getting into, and just knowing that they weren't positive. So at that particular stage, you say the street life. I don't know if I think they're intertwined in the sense that I think he wanted to break free, and I think one of the quotes was, when he had taken a class and he felt so good about the class, he felt so good about doing something that was making a positive effect in his life. But he couldn't separate, the streets and drugs. I think when you look at those two, one, they're not separate entities. I just think that both of those things had bowled him over emotionally. And the fact that he would go into neighborhoods and leave his girlfriend at the time in the car and just go into a bad neighborhood and score some drugs. It was just, at that stage, Bobby, there was so much more that he was capable of. And it seemed like every time that he took a step up, that he took 2 steps back in some way. And, the extent that these things were happening to him were just, magnified from the fact that, everything that he was doing, became public as well. Like, these things were, some athletes, they go under the radar, or they're not publicized, but his whole life became this show. And I think, so it's hard to say which one, had more of an influence on what happened at the end of his life, but I do think it's hard to separate the two.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I would agree with that totally. And he said in that Showtime thing, one of his friends was trying to lift up his spirits and said, "You're a champion." And Camacho said, "Yeah, I'm a champion, but I'm a junkie first." And that was very telling. That was a very telling comment. I think of once when I interviewed Mike Tyson, and I mentioned to him how 4 boxers had recently passed away, and it was Arguello. I forgot the guy who was killed, and they thought his wife did it, and they didn't charge him. He was in some other country. I forgot his name. But I mentioned Camacho, who he was friends with Camacho, and I said, "Did you ever think that there, by the grace of God, could have been you. And Tyson said to me every day, Bobby, every day, he said, listen, I was bigger than those guys. He said, I was so cocky. I was so full of myself. I wasn't even paying my drug dealer. He said, I was daring somebody to shoot me. I wasn't even paying my drug dealer. I was daring somebody to shoot me. And I thought that was really a telling comment. And it makes me think about what you're saying about Camacho also. I give you a lot of credit that you focus so much on the positivity of him and where he came from and what he achieved. Because most people, especially in today's world, would have dealt with just the negative sensationalism. And speaking of that sensationalism, is there one thing that was so sensational, but you didn't want to put it in the book?
Well, the first thing from the beginning of the book, I kind of made a pact with myself that I wasn't going to sensationalize. I just didn't. I wanted to get all the facts and then present the depiction of Camacho, which I thought was fair, and I didn't think sensationalizing would do anything except just a cheap way out of writing a good biography on his life. So I wanted to find a balance, and I think that balance kind of came into the fact, like, I wanted to convey who he was as a son, as a father, as as a husband, as a fighter, and I wanted to give all these different faces of Hector. So I just didn't think it was fair to take someone's life and sensationalize it with that. Now, your question is about, like, is there something that I didn't share? There were some stories here and there that seemed so implausible that even if I brought them into the forefront and told them in the book, I think, if anything, it would be degrading the book itself as well as Hector's overall reputation. And I think it was, when you hear us, and by the way, out of the four books, the macho stories reigned supreme. I mean, I didn't hear any stories from the other three fighters that were even close to this. Some of the things that I was hearing with Macho, but at the same time, you have to think to yourself, like, is it fair to, first of all, what's the what is this person sharing with me? Who's going to be affected by it? Okay, how are they going to be affected by it? And then, am I going to be able to possibly prove if this was true or not? Is there anybody else who can I can use as a source to prove what this person is saying? So there definitely were a couple stories here or there where I said, from the beginning, I said, there's no way that I would include this in a book. But at the same time, I think the book was personal enough that I also was concerned whether I wanted, did I give a person in Hector's life a fair, was I justified in the way that I portrayed them as well? So I think it goes both ways a little bit.
Right, right. As we're closing, tell me something that surprised you the most about Camacho. What did you learn about him that surprised you the most?
I think with as a father, yeah, I was just I think there was like a little bit of shock value, as well as it kind of almost like a warm feeling to know that he was a guy who probably wasn't the best father, but he had his moments where He would go in and, he's in the book I talk about how he would climb through the window and cuddle with his son like late at night. I mean,
Right.
not the best fatherly thing to do, but you at least knew he was loving. Hector would say that, he didn't always tell me he loved me, but he'd always shower me with kisses and hugs. I thought that was a nice element to it. He wouldn't show up. So he wouldn't show up to the birthday party on time, but he'd come at midnight, dancing around downstairs of the hotel, the building as Batman or a ninja, and he'd show up. It would just be really late,
Right. And he would make it macho time.
Yeah, and yeah, chanting it's macho time.
Right.
But I think to close that out, Bobby, I think the main thing is that I think he really wanted to be a good father. It's just that I don't think, and I think at times he was, but at the same time, I don't think the way that he was living allowed him to be a really, the type of responsible father that someone needed at that point in their life.
Let me give these parting words. On page 266, his son, Hector Camacho Jr., was a former fighter himself. And you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, and I'm going to read something that you quoted in the book. And he said, and I quote, "Me knowing how his life was and how he lived his life, I expected something like this to happen. I'm coping with it. It's not easy. It's life. I loved him. I respected him. I didn't understand him, but he was my idol." Close quote. And I think that encompasses a lot of what you said. He knew his father had some issues and maybe wasn't the best father at times, but he knew that his father loved him. And he was his idol. His father was his idol. And I think Camacho Jr. is really happy and proud of the way that you wrote this book. And you touched on a lot of things that a lot of people did not do. So great job. And I don't do interviews. I do conversations. Family, get this fantastic book, Macho Time, The Meteoric Rise and Tragic Fall of Hector Camacho, authored by my guy, Christian Giudice. Thank you very much, Christian, for all your time today. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation about a quarter of as much as I did reading your book. So thank you very much.
Bobby, hey, it is a absolute joy to talk to you. And I love these conversations. There's no one who does the research and puts in the time with this book. And I just want to thank you for kind of taking me through a lot of these things with the book. I feel like it's going through it again and reliving some of these moments. So thank you so much for all the work and hard work you do on your end. And it's a true pleasure to talk to you, buddy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Family, thanks for listening and always supporting your show and mine, Bobby Ramos Bottom Line. I don't want to be a man of power, but I do want to be a man of purpose. I'm Bobby Ramos. Thank you for your time this time. Until next time.